please take your Bible and join me in Genesis 19. Genesis 19, we're going to be looking at the first 26 verses of the chapter this morning. If you're using the blue ESV Bible and the seat backs out there, you can find our text on page 13. We're in Genesis 19, and the title of the sermon is Heavenly Visitors, Part 2. John Bunyan's allegory of the Christian life, the Pilgrim's Progress, illustrates, among many things, the importance and the certainty of perseverance of the true Christian. While the Christian life will include failures, each obstacle will and shall and must be overcome as progress is made onward to the celestial city. A strange scene early in the book, in the interpreter's house, opens up to us the truth of perseverance. Christian sees a fire burning against a wall and one standing by it, always pouring water on the fire in order to quench it. And yet the fire simply burns brighter and hotter. Christian asks interpreter, "What does this mean?" And interpreter answers. He says, "The fire is the work of grace that is wrought in the heart. He that cast water upon it to extinguish and put it out is the devil." The interpreter then shows him the other side of the wall. There Christian sees a man with a vessel of oil, which he continually but secretly pours on the fire. The interpreter says, "This is Christ, who continually, with the oil of his grace, maintains the work already begun in the heart, by means of which, notwithstanding what the devil can do, the soul of his people prove gracious still." We're going to consider the narrative of Genesis 19 this morning in part, and then we're going to consider more of it next week, Lord willing. There's just too much to unpack in one sermon, and really all of chapter 18 and 19 form really one cohesive unit, and so there's many things to consider in these two chapters. We're going to focus on the first 26 verses of chapter 19 today, as I said, and the theme of perseverance is going to be key for us this morning. And before we get into the text of Genesis 19, I want to, by way of reminder, note that Genesis 18 and 19 are they serve as a pinnacle of sorts for a narrative that has been in development ever since Genesis 10. Prior to even reading these two chapters, we know that Sodom and Gomorrah were Canaanite territories. We saw that in chapter 10, verse 19. We know that the men of Sodom were great sinners against the Lord in chapter 13. We saw these cities involved in the giant wars into which Abraham was also dragged because of his nephew Lot's rather ill-guided choice to move to Sodom in the first place in chapter 14. And last week in chapter 18, as Abraham went out with his three guests, who had his three guests, his heavenly visitors, he was going out with them to send them on their way after dinner, and we saw the Lord ask, seemingly to the other two men with him, he says, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" He concludes that because he had chosen Abraham to be the vessel through whom he would bring blessing to the world, he tells Abraham that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is very great, and their sin is very grave. The Lord tells Abraham that he was going to go down to see whether they had, in fact, done according to the outcry that was against them. Now, the other two men from there set out. Now, our text explicitly identifies them as angels. They set out from the place where they were to go toward Sodom, but the Lord, Yahweh, stays behind to speak with Abraham, and they have a discussion about the city, about Sodom, and about what justice would require if there were to be found even 10 righteous people in it. And the Lord concludes that he would not, for the sake of 10 righteous people, if he could find 10 righteous people, he would not destroy the city. And then the chapter ends by saying that the Lord went his way, onward to Sodom, as he had said in 1821. He is going to inquire about this city. And so I want to pick up there, read the passage. We're going to read the first 26 verses, outline the text, and begin our work. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called out to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge? Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of this place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry of its people has become great before the Lord." The outcry against his people have become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh, no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and is it not a little one? Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities, and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife, behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. There are three observations that I want to make with you this morning. First, in verses 1 to 11, we see the city condemn itself. Second, in verses 12 through 22, we see Lot spared by the mercy of God. And third, in verses 23 through 26, we see the Lord destroy the cities of the valley. So look with me in the first place then at verses 1 to 11, where we see the city condemn itself. The two men, or angels, arrive in Sodom and find Lot, who perhaps had become something of an elder in the city. He's sitting in the gate where judgments were often made. He's sitting there and he welcomes the guests, the visitors. He sees the angels, and very similar to as Abraham had done, he rises to meet them, he bows himself before them, and he entreats them to stay the night at his house, to wash their feet and rise early the next day so that they may be on their way early. They intended, however, to stay the night in the town square. They were there to make an investigation, to find out what was going on. But Lot insists that is no place for them to stay. He insists, and so they yield, and they enter his house. And he makes them a feast. He bakes unleavened bread, and they eat together. And at first, when we consider Lot, we're quite encouraged by all of this. He responds, as I said, with a spirit of hospitality similar to that of Abraham. We saw this last week where he welcomes the guest very intentionally and speedily. Perhaps Lot, too, had been struck by the Lord's own display of hospitality in Melchizedek in Genesis 14. He certainly is demonstrating here a genuine measure of humility and hospitality, and it's commendable, it's imitable, and it is, to be clear, in direct conflict with the inhospitable pride that the rest of Sodom demonstrates in the passage. After dinner, however, Lot's home is surrounded by the men of the city. The men of the city were told, young and old, every one of them down to the last man. They encircle the house and they call out to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Now, Lot's response to the request here, or the demand here, makes it abundantly clear that this knowing is what you would call a euphemism. The Bible often uses the term know in this way. Adam knew his wife Eve, and she bore a son. Cain knew his wife, and she bore a son. And so Lot steps outside, he shuts the door, and he says, "Brothers, I beg you, don't act so wickedly." Now, some have seen the sin of Sodom primarily, or really exclusively, through the lens of a passage like Ezekiel 16, 49, and 50, where we're told that they were proud and inhospitable, and they didn't help the poor and the needy. But Lot's response here to them made clear that there's something else going on. And in Jude 7, he explicitly states that Sodom engaged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. And so what is it that these men are eager to do? Well, they're eager to commit one of two major sins, and there's overlap in them. Either they perceive that these men are of some supernatural race of angelic beings, and they are desirous to know them in some sense similar to what happened in Genesis 6, when the sons of God took the daughters of man and took them as wives, who bore to them a race of giants called the Nephilim, whom the Bible connects with many of the clans living in Canaan at the time. We saw this back in chapter 14. They were Sodom's neighbors, some of these giant clans, and many of them had been destroyed by Chedorlaomer in those wars. Now, of course, it's not a one-to-one. For one, it's men, the men of Sodom, not women, who are seeking to have these relations with the angels. So it's not even clear exactly what they thought would have resulted from this interaction if they did know they were angels. The events of Genesis 6 also were instigated by the sons of God, not by men. And here it's the men of Sodom who are instigating the issue in Genesis 19. But as we saw at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, this wouldn't be the first time where human beings were seeking some type of Genesis 6 interaction or Genesis 6 knowledge with supernatural beings. But whatever understanding the men actually had at the moment of who these two visitors were, there is a clear thematic connection with Genesis 6 in the author's mind, and we'll explore this more later on. But presently, we should note that what we see here is similar to Genesis 6 in that there, God had revealed to Noah that he would destroy the world significantly due to the multiplication of sexual sin and deviance on the earth. In Genesis 19, God reveals to Abraham and later to Lot that he will destroy these Canaanite cities due significantly to the multiplication of sexual sin and deviance in those towns. And what's more, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is also explicitly linked elsewhere with the flood in Scripture. We see it in Luke 17, Jesus does this himself, and in 2 Peter 2, 4 through 10, Peter does as well. Now, of course, it may be that these men simply think that these angels are men. They're just men, and they want to know them in the sense that the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament make plain is also a great sin in itself. Leviticus 20:13 explicitly says that for a man to lie with a man as with a woman, it is an abomination before God. Consensual or not, for some say that is the only thing wrong with Sodom was the non-consensual nature of what they wanted to do. Consensual or not, the Bible at every turn condemns homosexual intimacy as a sin. Indeed, it is a sin that may be forgiven, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. Nonetheless, it is, we must insist, a sin and cannot be a part of a faithful Christian life. And so, some sexual sin, either of a homosexual nature or of a supernatural nature of some kind, these men are eager to engage in this. And Lot implores them, do not act so wickedly. And again, our view of Lot continues to rise, even though he still lives in Sodom, which may be problematic, but he's quite distinct from the rest of the city. He welcomes these guests and shows hospitality to them and is humble before them. And now, at great risk to himself, he stands the gap between his guest and the wicked men of Sodom. And so our view of Lot continues to rise. We begin to understand, Peter calls him righteous Lot. Now I understand it. But then he continues to speak, and the next sentence out of his mouth gives us great pause and alarm. He says, don't act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. There's that word known again. He says, let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. And I think it's important to let it sink in a minute. What is Lot doing? What is Lot saying here? Do not violate these men, my guest. No, violate my virgin daughters who have lived all their lives under the shelter of my roof. Do whatever seems good to you. Words fail me. coherent thoughts flee from our minds when we try to picture this scene. Here is a father standing before a crowd of ravenous men who are seeking, to be clear, to rape the two angels who are lodging at his home. And what does he do? He offers them his daughters as a way to pacify their lust. Now, it wouldn't justify his suggestion if he did know their supernatural origin. But that seems to be about the only thing that could even begin to explain how he thought offering his daughters to the men to be abused by them all night, how that is a better option. As awful as this suggestion is, to do such a thing to heavenly beings surely would be worse than to violate another human being, he must think. Whatever he thought, there is really nothing that I can find commendable or justifiable in the suggestion. Lot has clearly changed since his days in Genesis 13, when he and his men fought and bickered with Abraham over the land. But now, in this most pressing and trying moment, he demonstrates just how far he has to go. The men of Sodom, however, are not to be deterred. They direct him to stand back, and they exclaim, "This fellow wants to judge us. He came to sojourn. Now we'll deal worse with you than we would have with them." And so they press in, they attempt to break down the door, and the angels intervene. They bring Lot inside, shut the door behind them, and they strike the men of the town with blindness. And what do the men of the town do? They exhaust themselves groping for the door. And here, as something of an aside, we see the utter foolishness of sin, the destructive power that it wreaks in our lives. I want to be careful not to sound super arrogant or high and mighty here, but I can't help but have this thought. I don't know about you, but I genuinely struggle to imagine being so intent on violating another person that if I were struck blind, that I wouldn't be deterred in the slightest. The will of these men seems completely unfazed by being blind in an instant. They continue to grope for the door such that they wear themselves out in failure. Proverbs 13, 18 through 20 comes to mind here. It says, "Poverty and disgrace come to him who ignores instruction, but whoever heeds reproof is honored. A desire fulfilled is sweet to the soul, but to turn away from evil is an abomination to fools. Whoever walks with the wise become wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." These men, this town, this city, it has not only ignored instruction. Lot told them, don't act so wickedly, turn back. But they refuse to turn back. They refuse to turn away from evil, and so they are proven a company of fools now to suffer harm. And not just the harm of being struck blind, either permanently or temporarily. The Lord has sent his angels to inquire if the outcry against the city was true. Sadly, indeed, the city has condemned itself. Well, look with me in the second place, verses 12 through 22, where we see Lot spared by the mercy of God. The angels have made their investigation, and now they pronounce their judgment. They ask Lot, "Do you have anybody else here? Do you have anybody else in this city? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters. This place is going to be destroyed, so go and get them." And so he leaves the house, and he finds his sons-in-law, whom we are told were yet to marry his daughters. And he warns them of the impending danger, the impending doom. And he tells them to flee. But they thought he was kidding. And so, as morning dawns, it's time to go. And the angels turned to him, and they urged him. They said, "Up, take your wife and your daughters and go." And then we have these exceptionally sad words. But he lingered. I want to come back to this thought next week, Lord willing, when we conclude Lot's narrative, but we should make some note of it here. Things have reached a fever pitch in the city. Lot's efforts to change the place, if he had made any, they've obviously come to nothing. The city is condemned. The angels have rendered the verdict. The judgment is nigh, and Lot just cannot tear himself away. He wasn't even being asked to leave his wife or his daughters behind, but he just couldn't leave. He lingered. No wonder his sons-in-law didn't take him seriously. They look at the man and think, what a joke. And so the men, the angels, they seized him and his family by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and they set him outside the city. And here is where I think the Lord has rejoined the party. Remember, at the end of 18, he had gone his own way, heading toward the city. It seems that sometime by morning he has arrived. And so he and the angels, they seized lingering Lot and his family, and they all but dragged them out of the city. And notice now, it's only one who speaks, beginning of verse 17. Of course, it's possible that it's one of the angels who are speaking, but so far in chapter 19, wherever the angels have spoken, it has been in the plural. We will do this, we will do that. But now, after an explicit reference to Yahweh, the singular returns. We're told one of the men tells Lot, "Escape for your life, do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And then Lot responds somewhat shockingly. He says, "No, my lords, thanks for everything and all. I really appreciate you doing me the solid of saving my life, but there's just no way I can make it to the hills. It's too far. It's quite a trek. Hills are hard work. Something bad might happen to me, and I might die." And so then he emphasizes the small size of a nearby city, which chapter 14 told us originally the name was Bela. He says, it's so small. It's this tiny little city. Would you let me go there instead? It's just such a small city. And it seems that he's emphasizing the size of the city in order to suggest that it's just not a particularly significant request. He's not asking for much. Give me this small, tiny city, please. Is that too much to ask for? You're taking everything else away from me. And so, for reasons somewhat unclear, the Lord graciously tolerates the requests, and he permits it, and he grants it. And so the name of the city was called Zoar after that. Zoar means small. But the Lord does tell Lot to hurry. Hurry, he says, I can do nothing until you arrive safely. And so as we consider Lot and we consider his life, he started strong, at least in this particular narrative in Genesis 19, but he's not doing very well at this point. He was humble and hospitable at first. He clearly didn't approve of the wicked desires of the men of the city, but then he offers his virgin daughters to them as a possible solution to satisfy their lust. He fails to convince his sons-in-law of the dangers they faced or even to be taken seriously. He refuses to leave the city when it's time to do so, and he must be practically dragged out of the city. And now he insists on simply going to a nearby town instead of actually obeying God's command to go all the way to the hills. And yet, though the city has condemned itself, we continue to take heart because the Lord is merciful to Lot. He grants the request, and I just love what it says. that they seized them by the hand. Verse 16, the Lord being merciful to him. Whatever we think of Lot and his character, whatever goodness he had or didn't have, what stands out is God's mercy. Why does Lot escape Sodom? Because God is merciful. And so the city's condemned itself. Lot is spared because of the mercy of God. But now we come in the third place, verses 23 through 26. The Lord destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot in company, according to verse 23, or Lot perhaps running ahead of some of them. He comes to Zoar, and the sun is up. And then what happens next is truly terrifying. It's mysterious and awful in every sense of the word. The Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. I want to think a bit more about the judgment of it all next week, Lord willing. But here I want to consider a distinction that seems to be made between the Lord who rained on Sodom and Gomorrah the sulfur and fire on the one hand, and the Lord out of heaven from whom he named it, or from whom he rained it. It's a bit of an odd description, verse 24, but it's an important verse, right? If Yahweh was the one speaking with Abraham in Genesis 18, and he left that conversation to go on to Sodom and was part of the men who dragged Lot out of the city, then he is the one who from earth rains fire and sulfur on these cities, doing so from the Lord out of heaven. There's a Yahweh on the earth and there's a Yahweh in heaven. And this, of course, is no polytheism, for Yahweh is one. But what we seem to have here is unity within diversity, or diversity within unity. There's something that the New Testament will explore much more thoroughly and properly regarding the triune nature of God. But in seed form here, fairly explicitly, we see the Father and the Son working together. Of course, the Spirit would not be absent in this work, though he is, as far as I can tell, unmentioned in this passage. The pre-incarnate Son has met with Abraham with two angels. They shared a meal. He disclosed his plans to him. The angels went forth and they shared a meal with Lot, and they disclosed the Lord's plans to him. And the Son has now rejoined them, and having confirmed the wickedness of the city with the Father from heaven, he obliterates the cities of the valley. This is what we read. Yahweh overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the city and what grew on the ground. Again, I want to consider this a bit more next week, but it was an utterly devastating and public showing of judgment. Sulfur and fire were poured out upon Sodom, Gomorrah, and all the cities of the valley except for this little city, Zoar. God utterly destroyed the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. It was an utterly pervasive destruction, like the flood in Noah's day. Nothing was left. Now there's smoke and ash. And then we read this curious verse in verse 26, that at some point in all of this, somewhere behind Lot, perhaps not quite to Zoar, his wife looks back and instantly becomes a pillar of salt. And it's at this point where we'll leave off with the exposition of the passage in the narrative. The city's condemned itself. Lot is spared and shown mercy by the Lord, who swiftly and severely judges the inhabitants. And yet, even Lot's wife, while she set out with him and their children, she does not flee all the way to safety. She longs for the town of iniquity. She turns back and looks and perishes in an instant. And so what do we learn from this passage? Well, there are 2 points of application that I want to make in closing this morning. First, again, we'll consider Lot's legacy a bit more fully next week, but I want to draw a lesson from Lot for us today. He's presented as something of a mixed bag in Genesis. All right, we'll see this even more next week in the end of chapter 19. And frankly, it's easy to criticize Lot. But Peter describes him, as I said earlier in 2 Peter 2, he describes him as righteous. Righteous Lot. He says, God rescued righteous Lot, describing him as greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. For as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. In other words, one thing that we are permitted to take away from Genesis 19 is that the Lord is merciful even to Lot, whose righteous character, by Peter's reckoning, is seen almost entirely in the dis-ease he experienced in Sodom. Think about what he says. He calls him righteous Lot and says he was simply tormenting himself, living amongst the wicked. He goes on to say, Peter, that in light of God's rescue of Lot, we may know this, that the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. Yes, Lot displayed humility and hospitality. He clearly stood against the sin of the city. But in the most important moment of his life, he nearly all but failed. What if the men of the city had welcomed his request and taken his daughters instead? What if they had not been so hard-hearted, so bent on evil and destruction? Lot is spared by their wickedness. He can't save his sons-in-law. He can't even save himself. He has to be dragged out of the city. But once he's there, he does leave, and he does go. In Peter's assessment of him, Lot's spiritual life can be summarized best as being miserable, living among wicked sinners. So, this isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. We surely, most assuredly, hope for better things for ourselves and for our children, but Peter's assessment of Lot reveals, even if quite shockingly, that Lot's misery was a demonstration of genuine faith. Little fruit is not the same thing as no fruit. And so, brothers and sisters, take heart. Remember Lot, both in his sorrow and in his salvation. Right? Do not hear me recommending that you settle for this, but take heart, little faith. Even if your life amounts to not much more than tormenting your soul over the wickedness around you, and while you're at it, in you, if you have been united to the Son of God by faith, you will be saved. The command is clear, however. You must flee the wrath to come. Your salvation from it isn't based upon how fast you are, how swift, how adept at getting out, fleeing to Jesus at all is what counts. God was merciful to Lot, and that is why he left, but leave he did. If he had stayed, if he had gone back into the city, he too would have perished. The warning has been issued. The call to flee has been given. Peter tells us that Sodom and Gomorrah are a picture of what is to come. Wrath is coming upon the world because of sin and rebellion against God. And as the hymn goes, we have no shelter from our sin, but in thy wounded side. And so, if you have not done so, will you fly to Jesus Christ for safety? Escape to the hill of Golgotha and be saved, or be swept away. But this exhortation to flee brings up a second point of application. The Lord Jesus, he exhorts his disciples concerning the day of the Son of Man, and he tells them in Luke 17:32, he says, remember not Lot, remember Lot's wife. J.C. Ryle's book, Holiness, is one that I cannot recommend highly enough. Buy it, read it, discuss it, read it again, give it away to someone to read, buy it again, and just repeat the process over and over again. It is a wonderful book, and it includes a chapter on Lot's wife. And Ryle makes some very helpful observations. I won't go through all of the things that he says, but there are several points that we need to consider. And so most of the rest of the following is not original to me. It's from Ryle. He notes that Lot's wife had many privileges. She had many privileges, but no grace. She was married to a righteous man. She surely heard, either directly or indirectly, the promises of God to Abraham. She had been seized and taken out of the city. She even began the flight from Sodom, but these blessings did her no good. In the end, she really couldn't leave. Lot struggled to leave. His wife couldn't leave. Her looking back was not the accidental backward glance of a grace-filled soul in a moment of weak curiosity or something like that. Her look, remember, it was in direct disobedience to God's express command. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the valley. So it was directly disobeying the express command of God. It demonstrated proud unbelief. She found it unnecessary to make a hasty flight. I can take my time. I can look back. And it told of a secret love for the world as her heart was still in Sodom. One of the most striking things about the Pilgrim's Progress is how it ends. I referenced something of how it began at the beginning of this sermon, but part 1 ends with the narrator recounting how Christian got to the end. He got to the celestial cities. Spoiler alert, but it's like 400 years old at this point, so if you haven't read it, that one's on you. He gets to the celestial city, he gets through the river Death, and he's into the city. But then the narrator notes, one, ignorance. He crossed the river much easier than Christian had. It gets ferried across by somebody. He walks up to the gate and he knocks, and he's asked for his certificate, but he finds none. No true invitation and warrant to be there. No hope in the king, and so the king commands the two shining ones that conducted Christian and hopeful to the city to take ignorance, bind him hand and foot, and have him away. And so they take him up, they carry him through the air to the door in the side of the hill, and they put him in there. And thus we learn, the narrator tells us, that there was a way to hell even from the gates of heaven, as well as from the city of destruction. Lot's sons-in-law perished, never having left Sodom. Lot's wife, she set out from Sodom, physically, not spiritually, and her heart was always there, but she stopped short of the finish line. Or we're not told, but how close to Zoar and to safety had Lot's been before she looked back? We're told she was behind Lot, somewhere behind him. But whether she was 10 feet from the journey's start or 10 feet from its end, she did not finish her race and she perished. So this raises some questions for us. We'll ask them, and then we will be done. First, do we presume upon the blessings of grace around us? Do we neglect to ensure that grace is actually in us? Children, do you content yourselves that your parents or your siblings are following after Jesus, but you find no need to do so yourself? Husbands, wives, are you content that your spouse is fleeing the wrath to come, but you are completely unburdened to escape yourself? And remember, how you start is only part of the matter. You must follow him to the end. This is what Ryle laments. He says just how true it is of so many of us who fail to take heed to the warning. He says, beware of ever supposing that you may go too far in religion and of secretly trying to keep in with the world. Do not try to drive a hard bargain as if you wanted to give Christ as little of your heart as possible and to keep as much as possible of the things of this life. Beware lest you overreach yourself and end by losing all. So, brothers and sisters, remember Lot's wife. There is, after all, a way to hell at the very gate of heaven itself. Press on all the way to the end.